All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking what honestly feels like a slow-moving geopolitical thriller, one that directly connects the Middle East to the American West Coast. We're looking at some recent geopolitical analysis that outlines a fast-approaching, frankly jarring reality for a massive chunk of the United States. It's this wild collision of international conflict, super complex oil extraction mechanics, and, well, simple, stubborn geography. And together, it creates one massive logistical headache.
So, here's the massive contradiction we're tackling today. Thanks to the Shale Revolution, the United States overall is a huge net exporter of crude oil and refined products. I mean, the nation is practically swimming in shale oil. But despite all this domestic abundance, California is staring down an absolutely imminent energy crisis. You gotta wonder, right? How on earth does a state inside an incredibly energy-rich nation suddenly find itself cut off? Well, to figure that out, we have to actually follow the data and track the supply chains.
Which brings us to Section 1, the Persian Gulf Shut-In. You see, the root of this whole West Coast problem actually starts thousands of miles away, over where the Strait of Hormuz has functionally been closed. And this brings us to a really crucial concept, one that honestly a lot of people get wrong when they look at global oil markets. It's called shut-in oil. We aren't just talking about a temporary navigation block where ships drop anchor and wait it out. No, because there's nowhere to safely ship or even store the oil, the actual production has to stop. The oil gets shut in. You can't just flip these massive, highly complex oil fields on and off like a light switch. Shutting down a well takes a ton of work, and turning it back on? That's an entirely different beast.
And there's this massive disparity in how different countries actually handle this. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, for example, have fields uniquely designed for mothballing. It's essentially a warm shutdown. If they have to halt production, they can usually bring those fields back online in, say, about 90 days. But for the rest of OPEC, places like Iraq, Kuwait, or Qatar, totally different story. They just don't have that capability. Once you shut their wells down, it takes some serious engineering and heavy labor to restart. I mean, to put that into perspective for you, after Saddam Hussein fell, it literally took Iraq 20 years to fully rebuild and get its production back. 20 years.
So the absolute crucial point here is the staggering volume we were talking about. Right now, across the Persian Gulf region, between 10 to 12 million barrels of crude a day are currently shut down. 10 to 12 million. And because of those infrastructure limitations we just talked about, only about 1.5 million of those barrels could even theoretically come back online in a meaningful time frame like 3 months. That means the vast majority of that crude is offline, not just for a season, but likely for a couple of years, maybe even longer.
Moving on to Section 2, the global supply ripple.
Because global energy operates as this incredibly tight network, the loss of all those millions of barrels doesn't just politely stay in the Middle East. It creates this very predictable, slow-moving domino effect across the world's oceans. You can literally track the tankers drying up chronologically. First, the disruption hit South Asia. They were the very first region to feel the pinch. Next, that ripple moved right over to Southeast Asia. Then, just within the last 2 weeks or so, Northeast Asian nations like Japan and China, along with Europe, saw their absolute final tankers of pre-war crude arrive. And finally, hitting step 4 right now, this exact week, the very last of those pre-war tankers have crossed the Pacific and arrived at California ports. The ripple has officially crashed into the West Coast.
Let's look at Section 3, California's unique energy problem. Okay, let's zoom in to the micro level and examine the localized math here. We need to understand why California is so incredibly vulnerable to this specific global shock, way more so than the rest of the U.S. Well, for a whole mix of reasons over the years, California's local oil production has essentially been decimated. Today, the state is only producing about 300,000 barrels a day locally. But let's actually put that 300,000 number into context. As California's economy grows and its population keeps expanding, their actual daily demand sits at an enormous 1.4 million barrels every single day. So do the math. Subtract their pretty meager local production from that massive demand, and you're staring at a 1.1 million barrel gap. Every day, California absolutely must import 1.1 million barrels of oil just to keep the lights on and the cars running. And right here is exactly where the trap snaps shut. Just shy of 50% of all that imported oil California relies on, it comes directly from the Persian Gulf producers. Yep, the exact same producers who, as we just talked about, suddenly can't get their crude to market because their wells are completely shut in. Just like that, almost half of California's daily lifeline has simply vanished from the global supply chain.
This leads us directly to Section 4,
the coming West Coast squeeze.
So with those final pre-war tankers arriving and offloading at California ports literally right now, this localized shortage isn't just some future theory anymore, it's officially happening. Now, you might be wondering, hey, what about all that Texas shale oil we talked about earlier? Well, if you're in Texas right now, you're pretty much laughing all the way to the bank. You're tapped into a continental system that is deeply in surplus, completely connected by this massive pipeline network. But California essentially acts as an energy island. They are physically cut off from the rest of the country's oil surplus by the Rocky Mountains. There are literally zero pipelines crossing the Rockies to transport crude oil or refined products to the West Coast. None. If California needs domestic oil from, say, Texas or North Dakota, it has to be hauled over those mountains by slow trucks or railcars.
And because trucks and trains just simply can't move enough volume quickly enough to cover a million-barrel-a-day deficit, the consequences are super stark. The West Coast, specifically California, Oregon, and Washington, is facing imminent, significant fuel shortages. The most immediate result of all that scarcity? Considerably higher energy prices, heavily isolated right there on the West Coast. Plus, to actually rescue these states, the U.S. is going to have to take every little bit of domestic fuel it can spare, and instead of exporting it globally for a profit, keep it within its own borders just to meet the West Coast's needs. It just tosses one more massive problem right into the global energy mix.
Which brings us to our final point, Section 5. No quick fix insight.
We really need to look at the long-term reality here, because it's absolutely vital to understand that this is not a problem that just gets solved overnight. As one geopolitical analyst put it, this doesn't come back with a peace deal. That's not this year, and it's probably not next year either. The analysis is crystal clear on this. Even if some absolute perfect peace deal is magically signed tomorrow, and the Persian Gulf becomes 100% safe for navigation, you still have the sheer physical reality of restarting those deeply shut-in oil fields in places like Iraq. It takes years to reopen those fields and get the shipping lanes flowing with crude again. So, unfortunately, this localized energy crisis hitting the American West Coast, it's a multi-year reality.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. We've just traced how a conflict happening literally half a world away physically cuts off the energy supply to one of the largest economies in the U.S. purely because of a mountain range and a lack of pipelines. It's kind of wild when you think about it. As we watch California's energy island get squeezed over the coming years, I want you to consider your own region. As these global supply chains permanently fracture, how vulnerable is your hometown to the next geographical domino effect? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and as always, keep asking questions.